My name is Emmett Salazar. I'm a paramedic in Coos Bay, Oregon, and I'm the one who figured out that a trusted, small-town doctor had been killing his patients for years. Same emergency room, same physician, same 48-hour window after admission. I know this because I drove every single one of them to that hospital, and I kept a handwritten transport log. Every patient, every set of vitals, every timestamp. Dr. Nolan Pruitt had been practicing in this town for almost 2 decades. He coached Little League, he donated to the food bank, and when I told people what I'd found, they looked at me like I was the dangerous one. But the night I walked into that county health board meeting with my log and a stack of pharmacy records, Pruitt was sitting in the 3rd row. His hands were perfectly still. Now, before I go any further, if this story sounds like one you need to hear to the end, hit that subscribe button right now, because what Dr. Pruitt did to keep this buried, and what it cost him when those transport logs hit that table, that's where this gets hard to believe. Drop a comment, tell me where you're watching from, what time it is where you are. I want to know who's here for this. Let me take you back to March of 2019. That's when I met Renata Voss for the first time. Coos Bay sits on the southern Oregon coast, about 16,000 people. The bay itself is wide and gray most mornings. You get used to the fog, the smell of salt and diesel from the docks. I'd been running calls out of Station 4 for 6 years by then. You get to know a town pretty well from the back of an ambulance. You learn which intersections are bad on Fridays, which apartment buildings always have falls, which bars call you twice a month. Renata ran a bakery on Commercial Avenue called Voss and Flour. Terrible pun. Great bread. She was 34, dark curly hair, always had flour on her sleeves even when she wasn't baking. She sponsored the youth soccer league and left day-old pastries at the fire station every Tuesday. People in town they loved her. That's the only word for it. I'd never had a real conversation with her until the morning of March 9th. My partner Cody and I got dispatched to her bakery at 6:14 a.m. She'd collapsed behind the counter. Shortness of breath, rapid heartbeat, dizziness. We ran vitals in the truck. Her blood pressure was low but not critical. I wrote it all down. I always wrote it down. We delivered her to Coos Bay Regional and I figured that was that. Routine transport. She'd be fine. 41 hours later, Renata Voss was dead. Cause of death listed as acute cardiac event. She was 34 years old. And the thing is, I didn't think anything of it. Not then. That's the part that still gets me. I drove that woman to the place that killed her and I went home and ate dinner and watched TV. I had a small house off Newmark Avenue, nothing special. 2 bedrooms, a yard I never mowed enough. I was single, focused on work, volunteered with the Coast Guard Auxiliary on weekends. My life was small, and I liked it that way. I knew my neighbors. I knew the cashier at the Safeway by name. Coos Bay felt safe to me. It felt honest. I didn't know what honest looked like yet. Renata's death hit the town hard. There was a little memorial outside Voss and Flour. Flowers, candles, a hand-painted sign that said, "We'll miss your sourdough." People cried at the service. Dr. Pruitt attended. I saw him there. He shook hands with Renata's sister and said something quiet I couldn't hear. I think about that sometimes. Pruitt at the funeral. Standing there in his good jacket, accepting hugs from people whose neighbor he'd just killed. I don't know what you do with that image. I still don't. I want to be clear about something. I didn't start this investigation. I didn't wake up one morning and decide to be some kind of crusader. What happened is, I noticed something, and then I couldn't stop noticing it. About 3 weeks after Renata's funeral, I was updating my personal transport log at the kitchen table. I've kept one since my first year as a paramedic. Department logs are digital now, but I still write mine by hand. Patient initials, vitals at pickup, timestamps, notes about the call. My partner used to make fun of me for it. Called it my diary. I didn't care. It helped me remember. I was flipping back through the last couple years, and I stopped on a page from October 2017. A man named Gil Harwick, 51, retired longshoreman. I'd picked him up from his house on Radar Road after his wife called about chest tightness. Vitals were stable in the truck, nothing alarming. Delivered him to Coos Bay Regional. He died 36 hours later. Cardiac event. And the thing that made me stop flipping, his attending physician was Dr. Nolan Pruitt, same as Renata. I almost closed the notebook and told myself it was a coincidence. Pruitt was one of 3 ER doctors at Regional. Of course, some of his patients would overlap with my transports. That's just how a small town works. But I didn't close it. I kept flipping. January 2018. A 67-year-old woman from the senior center on Virginia Avenue. Shortness of breath, mild confusion. Vitals stable in the truck. Delivered to Regional, died 44 hours later. Cardiac arrest. Attending, Pruitt. August 2018. Troy Callison, 19 years old. I remember him because he was scared. First time in an ambulance. He'd fainted at the cannery where he worked seasonal shifts. Vitals fine. Delivered to Regional. Dead within 2 days. Heart failure. Attending, physician. Every single time. Dr. Nolan Pruitt. I sat at that table for a long time, maybe 2 hours. The coffee I'd made went cold. I could hear the neighbor's dog barking through the window, and I kept staring at those pages. 4 patients, different ages, different backgrounds, all stable when I put them in that truck, all dead within 48 hours, all ruled cardiac events, all treated by the same doctor. I almost picked up the phone right then, but what was I going to say? I'm a paramedic and I have a feeling about a doctor. I didn't have proof of anything. I had a notebook and a bad feeling. So I did what I always do when I don't know what to do. I went to bed, and I didn't sleep. Over the next 2 weeks, I went through every page of my transport log. 11 years of entries, and I found a 5th one. June 2017, before Gil Harwick. A woman named Patrice Ondine, 43. Picked her up from her home after a 911 call about fatigue and irregular heartbeat. Stable in the truck. Regional. Pruitt. Dead in 39 hours. Cardiac. 5 patients, 5 deaths. Same doctor. Same time window. Same cause of death. I should tell you, I tried to talk myself out of this. More than once. Pruitt was a respected physician. 19 years at Regional. He served on the hospital ethics committee, for God's sake. He was the doctor other doctors recommended. And I was, what? A paramedic with a spiral notebook? I started pulling what public records I could find. Obituaries first. All 5 were listed with cause of death as natural causes. I checked the county death registry online. Same. No autopsies ordered for any of them. Not one. That struck me as odd. Renata was 34. Troy was 19. 2 people under 40 die of heart failure in the same ER, and nobody orders a single autopsy? I tried calling the hospital's patient advocacy office. I left a message, gave my name, said I had concerns about patient outcomes. Nobody called back. I called again 3 days later. Same thing. The records room at the county courthouse was locked both times I went. Not closed, locked. Middle of a weekday. A sign on the door said, "By appointment only," but there was no number to call. I was stuck. I had questions and no one to ask them to. Then I did something I probably shouldn't have. I drove out to Gil Harwick's house on Radar Road. His widow still lived there. I knocked on her door on a Thursday afternoon. She opened it about 6 inches. I told her who I was. I said I was the paramedic who transported Gil to the hospital in 2017. She stared at me for a while and then she said, "Why are you here?" I told her I was looking into some patient outcomes at Regional, that I had some questions about Gil's care. She didn't invite me in. She started to say something. Her mouth opened and she looked over my shoulder at the street, like she was checking if anyone was watching. Then she stopped herself. She said, "Gil died because his heart gave out. Dr. Pruitt was very kind to us. He came to the funeral." And then she closed the door. But there was this half second before it shut, where her eyes didn't match her words. I can't explain it better than that. I sat in my truck for 10 minutes after that. I felt stupid. I felt like I was chasing something that wasn't there. Maybe Pruitt was just an ER doctor with bad luck. Maybe cardiac events are more common than I thought. Maybe I was the one with the problem. But 5 people. Around this time, I ran into Pruitt at the hospital during a patient handoff. This was maybe a week after the visit to Radar Road. He was standing at the nurse's station when I came in with a chest pain call. Routine transport. He wasn't even the attending for my patient, but he looked at me across the counter and said, "Salazar, you're still making house calls, I hear." He said it with a smile, warm, almost playful, but his eyes stayed flat. I said, "Just doing my job, doctor." He said, "That's good. That's what we need. People who stick to what they're good at." Then he picked up a chart and walked away. I need to tell you about Luann Briggs. Luann was a charge nurse at Coos Bay Regional. She'd worked there for 22 years, mid-50s, short gray hair, no nonsense. The kind of nurse who ran the floor without raising her voice. I'd interacted with her hundreds of times on patient handoffs. She always double-checked my vitals against hers. She was thorough. About a month after Renata died, I ran into Luann at the gas station on Broadway. She was filling up her Subaru and I pulled in behind her. We said hello. I asked how things were at the hospital. She said, "Fine, fine." And then, I don't know why I did this, I just said it. "Luann, have you ever noticed anything unusual about patients under Dr. Pruitt's care?" She didn't answer right away. She put the gas nozzle back in the pump. She looked at me with this expression I can't really describe. Not surprise, not fear, more like she'd been waiting for someone to ask. She said, "Not here." That was it, 2 words. Then she got in her car and drove away. I want to pause here. Have you ever had a moment where somebody's silence told you more than anything they could have said? Where a person's face answered a question their mouth wouldn't touch? That kind of silence. It stays with you. If you've had a moment like that, where what someone didn't say changed everything, I'd really like to hear about it. Drop it in the comments. Because what Luann told me 3 days later changed the shape of this whole thing. We met at a park off Flanagan Drive. She picked a bench near the water, away from the walking path. It was a Wednesday morning, overcast. The bay was flat and silver. She didn't waste time. She said, "I've been watching Dr. Pruitt for 3 years. I asked her what she meant. She said she'd noticed a pattern with certain patients, stable admissions who deteriorated rapidly within 24 to 48 hours of being placed under Pruitt's direct care. She said the medication logs for those patients showed adjustments that she couldn't reconcile with their intake vitals, doses that were too high, combinations that didn't make clinical sense. I asked her how many patients she was talking about. She said, "At least 7 that I'm sure of, probably more." 7. I had 5 in my notebook. She had 7 on her own list. And here I'd been sitting on this alone, thinking I was crazy. I asked her why she hadn't reported it. She looked out at the water for a long time. Then she said, "I tried, twice. I filed an internal safety concern with the hospital in 2018. It was reviewed by the chief medical officer. He said he found no irregularities. 3 months later, my shift was moved to nights. I filed a second one in early 2019. That one, I don't think it even went anywhere. The patient safety liaison told me the matter had been previously addressed." She paused. Then she looked at me and said, "You know who the chief medical officer is, right?" I shook my head. "He's Pruitt's brother-in-law." I didn't move. The wind was coming off the bay and it was cold, but I didn't feel it. My hands were on my knees and I just sat there processing what that meant. Pruitt's brother-in-law was reviewing the safety complaints about Pruitt. The system that was supposed to catch this was controlled by the person who needed it buried. That's when I understood. This wasn't negligence. This was architecture. I started building something. I'm not sure what to call it. A case, I guess. But that sounds more organized than it was. Really, I was just a paramedic with a spiral notebook and a charge nurse who met him in Parks. Luann gave me the patient initials from her list. I cross-referenced them with my transport log. 3 of her 7 matched mine. The other 4 were patients I hadn't transported. They'd come in by private vehicle or other ambulance crews. But the pattern was identical. Stable intake, rapid decline, death within 48 hours. All cardiac, all Pruitt. We were up to 9 possible cases spanning from 2016 to 2019. I want you to understand something about Coos Bay. This is not a big town. Nolan Pruitt wasn't just a doctor there, he was a pillar. He'd delivered babies. He'd treated people's parents. He ran a free clinic once a month at the community center on Anderson Avenue. His wife, Margot, organized the annual Harbor Festival. Their son played on the high school baseball team. The hospital's reputation was his reputation. The community's trust in Regional was built on people trusting Pruitt, which meant if Pruitt went down, the thing the whole town depended on, their hospital, their safety net, went down with him. The man who needed my silence was propped up by the very thing my evidence would destroy. When you start questioning someone like that in a town this size, you're not just questioning a doctor. You're questioning the town's idea of itself, and people don't like that. I started getting looks. I don't mean that in some dramatic way. I mean literally, people I'd known for years started looking at me different. At the fire station, one of the guys asked me if I'd been stirring things up at the hospital. He said it casual, like it was a joke, but it wasn't. My shift supervisor pulled me aside one morning and said, "Emmett, I don't know what you're doing, but I've gotten 2 calls about you. From the hospital. They said you've been making inquiries that are outside your scope." He was a decent guy, talked in short sentences, didn't dress things up. He said it straight. I said, "I have concerns about patient safety." He said, "Then file a report through proper channels." I said, "The proper channels are compromised." He looked at me like I'd said the earth was flat. He told me to be careful. That same week, I noticed a dark blue truck parked across the street from my house on Newmark. 2 nights in a row, same spot, headlights off. I couldn't see the driver. 3rd night it wasn't there. I told myself it was nothing. I don't know if it was nothing. Meanwhile, I was trying to get access to pharmacy dispensing records from Regional. That's where the real proof would be. The actual medication orders for those patients. Luann said the records existed in the hospital's internal system, but she couldn't access them without flagging her own login. She'd already been moved to nights after her first complaint. She wasn't willing to risk her job again. I understood that. I hated it, but I understood it. So I started looking for another way in. And that's when I hit the wall that would stay in front of me for almost 2 years. I found the Oregon Health Authority complaint line on a Wednesday morning. I'd just come off a 48-hour shift rotation. I sat at my kitchen table with my notebook open and dialed the number and felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. Relief. Because there was a system for this. There was a phone number. There were people whose entire job was to investigate exactly this kind of thing. I thought, okay, this is where it starts working. This is where the machine kicks in and does what it's supposed to do. I left a detailed message, gave my name, my credentials, the hospital, the doctor, the patient count. I hung up and felt lighter than I had in months. They never called back. I called again a week later, left another message. The 3rd or 4th time, they all blur together, I got a person. She put me on hold for 20 minutes, transferred me to the wrong department, and that person told me I needed to submit a written form. I submitted the form, got a letter back 6 weeks later that said my complaint had been received and would be reviewed. I called to follow up. They said they couldn't discuss open cases. I said I just wanted to know if there was an open case. They couldn't confirm or deny. I called the state medical board. They said physician complaints were confidential. I could file one. I did. Another form. Another waiting period. Another letter that said nothing. Every door opened onto another locked door. One afternoon between all this, I was running a call. Chest pains. Elderly woman at the assisted living on Ocean Boulevard. She was scared. I held her hand in the truck and told her she'd be okay. We got her stabilized, delivered her to Regional. She was fine. She went home 2 days later. I was filling out the transport log afterward, and I looked down at the page and saw Pruitt's name from the week before, just sitting there in my own handwriting. And whatever warmth I'd felt from that call, gone. Here's the thing nobody tells you about trying to expose something in a small town. It's not one big dramatic fight. It's months and months of nothing happening. You make a call. Nobody calls back. You send an email. It bounces. You drive somewhere. It's closed. You ask a question. Somebody tells you it's not your business. And the whole time, you start wondering if you're the problem. By fall of 2019, I'd been at this for close to 7 months with almost nothing to show for it. Luann and I still met every couple weeks, but she was cautious now. She said she'd overheard a conversation in the break room, 2 administrators talking about the paramedic who won't let it go. She said they'd used my name. And this is where I have to be honest. I almost quit. I seriously almost quit. I was sitting on my back porch one night. November, cold, you could hear the waves from a mile away in Coos Bay when it's quiet enough. And I thought about what would happen if I just stopped. If I closed the notebook. If I went back to my shifts and my volunteer hours and my quiet life. I could go back to just being a paramedic. Maybe meet someone. Have dinners that didn't end with me staring at a notebook. Have a normal, small, unremarkable life. And then the other thought. The one that sat in my chest. What if I was wrong? What if I'd gotten 5 families' hopes up? Or would if this ever went anywhere, and there was nothing there? What if Pruitt was just an unlucky doctor, and I was the guy who destroyed a good man's career over a coincidence? 5 people would still be dead. Renata would still be dead. But maybe I'd sleep again. I sat with that for about an hour, and then I went inside and opened the notebook. The reason I didn't quit, and I wish it was something noble, is that I kept seeing Troy Callison's face, 19 years old, scared in the back of my truck. I told him he'd be fine. I said, "We're going to take good care of you." And then he was dead in 2 days and nobody asked why. I couldn't let that go. Not because I'm brave, because I'd looked that kid in the eye. Have you ever been in a situation where you knew something was wrong, really deeply wrong, but the people around you treated you like the problem? Where your persistence was the disruption, not the thing you were pointing at? Would you have quit? I think most people would have. I almost did. I'd like to know what you would have done. Not what you think you should say, but honestly. Tell me in the comments. Because what Dr. Pruitt said to me the next month, that was the moment I understood exactly what kind of man I was dealing with. December 14th, 2019. I was at the Safeway on Newmark buying groceries. Just a normal Saturday. I was in the cereal aisle and I turned the corner and there was Pruitt. His wife Margot was down the next aisle. He had a cart half full. Normal guy doing normal things. He saw me and his face did this thing. It went tight for half a second, and then it relaxed into a smile. A big smile. Warm. Like we were old friends. He said, "Emmett, good to see you. How's the station?" I said something about it being fine. My voice sounded weird to me. Then he took a step closer and put his hand on my shoulder. Not threatening, gentle, fatherly. He said, "I hear you've been asking some questions around town, about patient outcomes." I didn't say anything. He said, "You know, I've been doing this a long time, 19 years, and I've learned that sometimes, especially in emergency medicine, people die. Good people, young people, and it's natural to want a reason. But not everything has a reason, Emmett. Sometimes a heart just stops." He squeezed my shoulder. Then he said, "I'd hate to see a good paramedic burn his career over something he doesn't understand." He smiled again, patted my shoulder twice, walked away. I stood in that aisle for I don't know how long. My hands were shaking, not from fear, from anger, because that wasn't concern. That was a warning delivered with grocery store manners. And the worst part? If anyone had been watching, they would have seen a nice doctor being kind to a young paramedic. That's how good he was. 2020 happened. COVID hit. Everything changed and nothing changed. The pandemic was chaos for all of us in emergency services. Double shifts, triple shifts some weeks. I remember one stretch in April where I slept in the station for 4 nights straight because we didn't have enough crews to rotate out. You'd suit up in the full PPE, the gown, the N95, the face shield, and by the end of a 12-hour shift your face was raw from the mask and your scrubs were soaked through with sweat underneath. The rigs smelled like bleach. We wiped down every surface between calls. Some calls, we'd show up and the family wouldn't let us in because they were afraid we'd bring the virus. Other calls, we'd show up and the patient was already gone. Luann and I had stopped meeting by then. She was overwhelmed at the hospital. Everyone was. The investigation went dormant. My notebook sat on the kitchen table unopened for weeks at a time. I'd walk past it on my way to the coffee pot, and I wouldn't look at it. I couldn't. But here's the thing about a pattern. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. Even when you're exhausted. Even when the world is falling apart. It's just there, in the back of your head, this shape that doesn't go away. In October of 2020, I transported a patient to Regional, a 62-year-old retired teacher. He'd had a dizzy spell at home. Nice man. He told me about his garden on the ride over, how his tomatoes had done better than expected that year. Vitals were stable in my truck. I handed him off at the ER and walked back toward the nurse's station to drop off my paperwork. That's when I looked up at the whiteboard. Pruitt, on duty. His name right there in blue marker. I stood in that hallway. My feet stopped moving before my brain caught up. I could hear the retired teacher behind the curtain thanking one of the nurses, saying he was sure it was nothing, saying he felt silly for calling 911. One of the nurses asked if I was okay. I said yeah. I went back to the truck. I sat in the driver's seat and I didn't start the engine. I just sat there with my hands on the wheel. I couldn't do anything. I had no authority. I had no proof that would hold up in that moment. I couldn't walk back in there and say, "Don't let that doctor treat this patient." On what grounds? My notebook? 40 hours later, the retired teacher was dead. Cardiac arrest. No autopsy ordered. That was number 10. At least 10 people that I knew about. And I had stopped looking. Something happened to me after that. I didn't feel angry or determined or any of those useful emotions. I felt tired. A bone-deep kind of tired that sleep doesn't fix. The kind where you sit down on the edge of your bed to take off your boots, and 20 minutes later, you're still sitting there. One boot on, one boot off, staring at the carpet. I stopped going out. I stopped volunteering with the Coast Guard Auxiliary. I stopped eating regular meals. I lost 14 pounds in 2 months. My partner Cody asked me what was wrong, and I said, "Nothing," and he didn't push it. Christmas of 2020. I was sitting at my kitchen table with a frozen pizza I'd barely touched. The transport log was open next to my plate. It was still on the retired teacher's page. I could hear my neighbor's TV through the wall, some holiday movie, laughter from the speakers. I was alone and the pizza was cold, and I was staring at a dead man's vitals. And right then, I don't know, something clicked. Not an epiphany, not a movie moment, more like I was tired of being tired. Does that make sense? I was exhausted by my own inaction. The shame of knowing and doing nothing was heavier than the investigation ever was. The notebook was right there. It had always been right there. January 2021. I called the FBI field office in Portland. I need to be honest about the FBI thing. It wasn't what I'd expected. I called. I got transferred 3 times. I left a voicemail with a field agent. I explained that I was a paramedic in Coos Bay and I had documented concerns about a pattern of patient deaths at a local hospital and that internal reporting channels had been compromised. She called me back 4 days later. She asked me to send what I had. I made copies of my transport log pages, all 10 patients. I wrote a timeline. I included Luann's information about the internal complaints and the chief medical officer relationship. I sent it by certified mail because I didn't trust email. Then I waited. 2 weeks. 3. A month. I called the field agent again. She said the materials had been received and were being reviewed. She said she couldn't tell me more than that. She thanked me for my patience. I wanted to scream, but I didn't. And meanwhile, Pruitt kept practicing. Every day. Seeing patients, writing prescriptions, attending community events, living his life. If this story is hitting you, hit that like button. Subscribe, because what happened next is the part I still can't believe. In March of 2021, I got a call from a different number, not the field agent. A woman from the U.S. Attorney's Office in Eugene. She said she wanted to meet me. I drove to Eugene on a Tuesday, 2.5 hours each way. She had an office in a federal building downtown. Small room, fluorescent lights, a desk with almost nothing on it. A single framed photo near the window. I couldn't see who was in it. She told me that my complaint had been forwarded to a joint federal-state healthcare fraud task force. She said they'd been looking at Coos Bay Regional for unrelated Medicare billing irregularities, and when my complaint came in, it overlapped with some anomalies they'd already flagged. She asked me to walk her through every patient. I did, start to finish. She took notes in a yellow legal pad. She didn't interrupt once, but when I got to Troy Callison, the 19-year-old, she stopped writing for a second. Just a beat. Then she kept going. When I finished, she closed the pad and said, "Mr. Salazar, I need to tell you something. You're not the first person to raise concerns about this physician." I said, "I know. The charge nurse filed internal complaints." She said, "Not just internally. There had been a complaint to the state medical board in 2017 from the family of Patrice Ondine, my first case. The family had questioned the rapid decline and requested an autopsy. The request was denied by the attending physician. Pruitt denied the autopsy request for his own patient, and the medical board complaint? Reviewed and closed. Insufficient evidence. I sat in that federal office, and I think I just stared at the wall for a while. The fluorescent light was buzzing. The prosecutor was quiet. She let me sit with it, because it meant this could have been stopped 4 years earlier. Patrice Ondine's family did the right thing. They asked the right questions. They went through the exact channels you're supposed to go through, and the system looked the other way. Every death after that closed complaint was preventable. The system had been told. It chose not to act. 5 more people died after that complaint was closed, including Renata, including Troy. After Eugene, things moved faster than I expected. The task force opened a formal investigation. They obtained a sealed warrant for Coos Bay Regional's pharmacy dispensing records, the records Luann and I had been trying to access for 2 years. And this is where I learned something that made the whole pattern make sense. The federal prosecutor called me in June of 2021. She said the dispensing records showed that 9 of the 10 patients I'd identified, 9 out of 10, had received potassium chloride injections within 12 hours of their deaths. The doses were 2 to 3 times the standard therapeutic range. Potassium chloride. In small amounts, it's a common medication. In large doses, it stops the heart. And it's virtually undetectable in a standard autopsy, if you even bother to order one. Pruitt hadn't just been a bad doctor. He'd been using a specific drug in specific doses to cause cardiac arrest that would look like natural heart failure. And because he was the attending, he controlled whether an autopsy was ordered. He denied every single request. 9 confirmed cases, 2016 to 2020, possibly more. I sat in my truck after that phone call for a long time. The engine was off. It was hot. June in Oregon, the sun doesn't set until 9. I was parked outside my own house and I couldn't go inside. 9 people. And I'd known. I'd seen the pattern in 2019. It took me nearly 2 years to get anyone to listen. Here's what I learned from all of it. Paying attention costs something. It costs you sleep and friends and the version of the world you used to live in. But looking away costs more. The task force spent the next several months building the federal case. They exhumed 3 of the victims, Renata Voss, Troy Callison, and Gil Harwick. The toxicology came back consistent with potassium chloride toxicity. They also obtained Pruitt's personal financial records. The prosecutor told me later there was no financial motive, no insurance fraud, no inheritance scheme. The investigators couldn't find a single monetary reason. She said the behavioral profile suggested something else entirely. A pattern of control. A physician who decided which patients lived and which ones didn't. Not for money, for power. That was the hardest thing to understand. There was no reason. There was just him. And now here's where I need to tell you what I did next. Because the federal investigation was proceeding, and legally I wasn't supposed to do anything. The prosecutor told me to be patient. She said they were building something airtight. But the Coos County Health Board had its annual public session scheduled for September 17, 2021. Open to the public. 1 meeting a year. If I missed it, Pruitt would practice for another 12 months before the next one. Another year of patience. Another year of that white board with his name on it. Would you have waited? Honestly, if you were me, with what I knew, and there was a room full of people who needed to hear it, would you have sat at home? I genuinely want to know. Tell me in the comments, because I've asked myself that question 100 times. I checked my bag one more time. Notebook, pharmacy summary. My hands were steady. What I'm about to describe is the longest 20 minutes of my life. September 17th, 2021. Coos County Public Health Board meeting. Held in the community room at the Coos Bay Public Library on 4th Street. Folding chairs. Fluorescent lights.
About 60 people, which was more than usual. They'd been discussing COVID protocol updates.
I got there early, took a seat in the back row. I had my transport log and a canvas bag on my lap. I also had printed copies of the pharmacy dispensing summary that Hollis had, reluctantly, allowed me to reference in a public setting, with patient names redacted. She told me I wasn't prohibited from speaking at a public meeting, but she asked me to be careful. Pruitt was in the room, third row, left side. Same as always, khakis, button-down shirt, lanyard with his hospital badge still around his neck. Margot was next to him. He looked relaxed. Why wouldn't he? This was his town. The meeting started at 7 p.m. They went through the agenda items one by one. COVID metrics, budget allocation, flu clinic scheduling. Normal stuff. Nobody was paying much attention. At 7:38 p.m., they opened the floor for public comment. 3 people spoke before me. One about a pothole, one about mask mandates, one about a noise complaint near the waterfront. Then I stood up. My legs felt heavy. I walked to the lectern at the front of the room. I set my notebook on it. I adjusted the microphone. I said, "My name is Emmett Salazar. I'm a paramedic with Coos Bay Fire and Rescue. I've worked in this community for 11 years, and I'm here tonight because 9 people are dead, and nobody in this room has asked why." The room went quiet. Not dramatically, people just stopped shuffling. I opened the notebook. I read the names. Patrice Ondine, Gil Harwick, Dolores Kemp, Troy Callison, Renata Voss, Alvin Drucker, and 3 others from Luann's list that had been confirmed by the task force: Ray Fonseca, Coraline Sheff, and Deborah Lundeen. I read each name, each date of transport or admission, each cause of death. Heart failure, heart failure, heart failure, heart failure, 9 times. Then I set down the notebook and I held up the pharmacy summary. I said, "Every one of these patients received potassium chloride in doses 2 to 3 times the therapeutic range within 12 hours of their death. Every single one. And every one of them was under the direct care of the same attending physician." I looked at Pruitt. He was sitting very still. His wife's hand was on his arm. His face hadn't changed. He was looking at me the way you'd look at a fly. The board chair, a woman named Dorothy Sato, said, "Mr. Salazar, these are extremely serious allegations. Do you have documentation to support?" I said, "Ma'am, I have 11 years of transport logs. I have a pharmacy dispensing record obtained through federal warrant, and I have a formal federal investigation currently being conducted by the U.S. Attorney's Office in Eugene." That word, federal, hit the room like a physical thing. People shifted in their seats. Someone in the back stood up. And then something happened that I didn't plan for. Luann Briggs was in the room. I hadn't known she was coming. She was standing against the back wall in her scrubs. She must have come straight from a shift. She stepped forward and said, "My name is Luann Briggs. I've been a charge nurse at Coos Bay Regional for 22 years. I filed 2 internal safety complaints about Dr. Pruitt in 2018 and 2019. Both were reviewed and dismissed by Chief Medical Officer Dr. Gerald Koss, who is Dr. Pruitt's brother-in-law. I have copies of both complaints and the responses." She held up a manila folder. The room erupted. Not shouting, just voices. Everybody talking at once. Dorothy Sato was banging her hand on the table trying to restore order. Pruitt's wife was whispering something in his ear. He was gripping the armrest of his folding chair. And then Pruitt stood up. He looked at me, right at me, and he said, "This is a witch hunt. This man is a paramedic with no medical training and a grudge. I have given 19 years to this community. I have saved lives in this hospital, and I will not sit here and be accused by—" His voice cracked. He stopped mid-sentence, looked around the room. 60 faces staring at him. Some of them people he'd treated, people whose kids he'd coached. He sat back down, didn't finish the sentence. For half a second, I saw something in his face. Not defiance, not anger, something closer to exhaustion. Like a man who'd been holding something up for a very long time, and his arms were finally giving out. Then it was gone. His jaw set. His eyes went flat. Dorothy Sato adjourned the meeting. I drove home from that meeting and pulled into my driveway, and I couldn't get out of the truck. The engine was off. The headlights were off. The street was quiet. I could see the kitchen light on through the window. I'd left it on before I left. My hands were on the steering wheel, and they were shaking hard enough that I could hear my watch tapping against the wheel. I don't know how long I sat there, 20 minutes, maybe longer. My stomach was turning. The adrenaline that had been holding me upright for the last hour was draining out, and what replaced it was, I don't have a word for it. Not relief, not sadness. Something my body understood before my brain did. Every muscle I'd been clenching for 2.5 years let go at the same time, and what was underneath was just empty, hollowed out. I finally went inside. I didn't turn on more lights. I sat at the kitchen table in the same chair where I'd first noticed the pattern. The notebook was in my bag. I didn't take it out. I just sat there. The arrest came 11 days later, September 28, 2021. Federal agents and Oregon State Police served a warrant at Pruitt's home at 6:15 a.m. He was charged with 9 counts of second-degree murder and 3 counts of tampering with medical records. The news hit Coos Bay hard. For the first few weeks, people didn't know what to say. Some of them, more than I expected, defended him. There must be a mistake. He was a good doctor. That paramedic always was a little odd. I heard that one more than once. That I was odd. That I had an obsession. But the evidence was overwhelming. The toxicology reports from the exhumations, the pharmacy logs, Luann's internal complaints showing the hospital had been warned twice, Pruitt's own medical records showing he denied autopsy requests for every patient who died under his care. Pruitt's brother-in-law, the chief medical officer, resigned within a week of the arrest. The hospital's board of directors hired an outside firm to audit patient outcomes going back to 2015. They found 2 additional cases that matched the pattern, 11 total. Renata's sister called me. I'd never spoken to her before. She was crying. She said, "I knew something was wrong. I told them her heart was fine. I told them she ran 3 miles every morning. Nobody listened. I didn't know what to say. I said, 'I'm sorry it took so long.' She said, 'You listened. That's enough.'" The trial was in federal court in Eugene, March 2022. It lasted 3 weeks. The prosecution presented the pharmacy records, the transport logs, the toxicology reports, the internal complaint history. They brought in a forensic pharmacologist who testified that the potassium chloride doses were incompatible with any legitimate therapeutic purpose. Pruitt's defense argued that the deaths were consistent with natural cardiac events and that the pharmacy records could have been improperly logged. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Guilty on all 9 counts. He was sentenced to life without parole. When the verdict was read, I was sitting in the gallery. Luann was next to me. She didn't say anything. She just reached over and held my hand. I sat there, and I could feel my pulse in my ears. I needed air. I stood up before the judge finished speaking, and I walked out of the courtroom, and I stood on the steps outside, and I put my hands on my knees and I breathed. Just breathed. For a long time. Outside the courthouse after sentencing, the Callison family, Troy's parents, were standing on the steps. His mother, a small woman in a blue coat, walked over to me. She said, "Troy would have been 23 next month." That's all she said. 23. I still think about that number. Coos Bay Regional implemented new protocols after the trial. Independent pharmacy audits. Mandatory autopsy requests for all in-hospital deaths of patients under 65. A third-party patient safety review system that bypassed internal administration entirely. The changes came too late for 11 people, but they came. It's been almost 2 years since the trial. I still live in Coos Bay. I still run calls out of Station 4. I still keep my transport log by hand in a spiral notebook, same as I've always done. My partner Cody stopped calling it my diary. Now he calls it the evidence locker. I think he's proud of it in his own way. I drive past Voss and Flower sometimes. It's a coffee shop now, different owners, but on the window, in small letters, there's a painted sourdough loaf with the initials RV. Someone in the new shop put it there. I don't know who. I've never asked. Luann retired from nursing last year. She said she was done. 23 years in that hospital and she was tired. I see her at the farmer's market some Saturdays. She buys peaches and we don't talk about Pruitt. We talk about the weather, about her garden, about normal things. It's good. I should tell you, I got a commendation from the U.S. Attorney's Office, a letter with a seal on it. It's in a drawer in my kitchen. I don't frame things. Pruitt is in a federal facility in Sheridan, Oregon. I don't think about him much anymore. I used to, every day. His face in that grocery store aisle, that hand on my shoulder. Sometimes a heart just stops. I used to replay it over and over. Now it comes maybe once a week, and it's quieter. It doesn't knock me sideways like it used to. What I think about more are the names. Patrice, Gil, Dolores, Troy, Renata, Alvin, Ray, Coraline, Deborah, and the two they found later, names I never knew in life but carry now anyway. 11 people who deserve to come home from the hospital. Now, if you stayed with me through all of this, I want to say something. Thank you. Genuinely. This was the hardest thing I've ever talked about, and the fact that you're still here means more than I know how to say. Telling this story was something I needed to do not just for me, but for those 11 names. If even one person hears this and thinks twice the next time something feels wrong, if one person picks up the phone instead of closing the notebook, then this was worth it. If this story meant something to you, hit the like button. Subscribe if you haven't. Not for me, for the next story that needs to be told. Because there are so many of them. So many towns where somebody knows something and doesn't know who to call. And I want to ask you something. Have you ever seen a pattern that nobody else would acknowledge? Something that was right in front of everyone, but you were the only one saying it out loud? I'd love to hear about it. Drop it in the comments. Your story matters just as much as mine. If you want to hear more stories like this, there are others on this channel. People who stood up when it would have been easier to sit down. Check them out when you're ready. I made coffee this morning before I sat down to record this. I drank it on my back porch, watching the fog come in off the bay. It was quiet. My phone didn't ring. Nobody was parked across the street. I just sat there and drank my coffee and listened to the water. That's enough. That's plenty.